On a blood-red dawn in 859, something appeared on the North African coast that shattered every assumption Muslim commanders held about warfare, geography, and their own invincibility. Battle lines, professional military formations stretching across sand that should never have known northern boots, shield walls, 3 rows deep, perfectly interlocked, gleaming with foreign iron, manned by warriors who had sailed thousands of miles through waters that belonged to Islam. Behind them, dragon-prowed longships scarred the beach in numbers that made counting futile. 30 ships, 40, 60, each one proof of a journey that every strategic calculation said was impossible. The garrison commander raced to the coastal vantage point and felt reality crack beneath him. These were Vikings, Northmen from frozen fjords and mist-covered forests where winter devoured half the year, pale-skinned warriors with blonde braids and axes designed for shipbreaking, now standing in disciplined ranks under a Mediterranean sun. They had no cavalry, the foundation of Islamic military supremacy, no siege engines, the tools of civilized warfare, no armor that Muslim doctrine recognized as militarily significant. Yet there they stood with the calm readiness of professionals who had done this before, shields locked edge to edge, axes resting on shoulders, eyes fixed on gates that had never fallen to any Berber force, any rival dynasty, any enemy the garrison had trained to fight. By the time the defenders understood this wasn't a raid, that these weren't pirates fleeing at first resistance, but an army prepared for sustained combat, the first cavalry charge had already shattered against those shields like waves against stone. By midday, tactics perfected across centuries of conquest from Andalusia to Damascus had proven utterly useless against warriors who fought by rules no Muslim commander recognized. By sunset, gates that had symbolized security for 200 years lay in splinters, and Viking boots rang on city streets, and when the longships finally departed, loaded with captives and treasure, they left behind something far more devastating than what they took. They left terror, not the manageable fear of bandits or pirates, threats you could prepare for, fight, defeat. This was existential horror. The realization that distance meant nothing, that naval supremacy was illusion, that the Mediterranean's assumed masters could be beaten on their own shores by barbarians from the frozen edge of the world. A garrison had been destroyed, tactical doctrine had been shattered, an assumption of invincibility had died, and a legend had been born that would echo through 3 generations of Muslim commanders, each one training troops on tactics that hadn't existed before 859. Each one feeling their hearts race when strange sails appeared on the horizon. The Mediterranean in 859 belonged to Islam in ways that went beyond maps or treaties. It belonged the way the sky belongs to eagles, through absolute mastery earned across 2 centuries of conquest, proven in countless battles and reinforced every day by fleets that moved unchallenged from Gibraltar to the Levantine coast. When Umayyad warships patrolled the western waters and Abbasid vessels controlled the east, they weren't defending territory. They were maintaining an order that had become as natural and permanent as the tides themselves. This dominance wasn't theoretical. It was written in the wreckage of Byzantine fleets that had challenged Muslim naval power and learned the cost of that arrogance. It was proven in the prosperity of coastal cities from Morocco to Syria that thrived under the protection of navies no European force could match. Merchants loaded cargo without fear. Pilgrims crossed to Mecca knowing Muslim ships controlled every critical passage. Children grew up never questioning who ruled these waters because the question itself seemed absurd. Islamic military tradition had been forged across territories that stretched from the conquest of Iberia to the subjugation of Persia. Muslim commanders understood cavalry warfare with sophistication that made Christian knights look like enthusiastic amateurs. They conducted siege operations using engineering knowledge inherited from Roman and Persian empires. Their naval tactics incorporated lessons from cultures they'd absorbed, creating a maritime doctrine that exceeded anything medieval Europe could imagine. These weren't hollow boasts, they were capabilities demonstrated repeatedly against every enemy foolish enough to test them. The warriors stationed along Mediterranean coasts in 859 were professionals shaped by this tradition. They'd trained against Berber cavalry, defended against rival Islamic dynasties, and prepared for threats they understood through experience and shared military philosophy. Their confidence wasn't blind arrogance. It was the rational assessment of men who knew their enemies, understood their own strengths, and operated within a strategic framework that had proven itself across centuries of victory. Viking raiders existed, certainly. Reports filtered south of northern barbarians terrorizing Christian monasteries in Ireland and Francia, attacking defenseless clergy and fleeing when serious resistance appeared. But those were different waters, different enemies, different calculations entirely. Vikings were pirates who struck isolated targets and vanished. They weren't organized military forces. They didn't possess the seamanship to navigate Mediterranean currents, the logistics to sustain campaigns far from home, or the tactical sophistication to engage professional armies in open combat. For Muslim commanders in 859, the idea that pagan barbarians from the frozen north could project military power into Mediterranean waters wasn't just unlikely, it was strategically absurd, tactically impossible, and beneath serious consideration. The Mediterranean had been conquered territory for 200 years. Muslim fleets had defeated Byzantine challengers, absorbed rival navies, and established supremacy so complete that the very concept of a northern threat seemed like asking whether fish might someday threaten eagles. The sea bowed to no one except Islam. Every naval battle won, every coastal city protected, every trading fleet that crossed unmolested proved this truth. And truth, they believed, didn't change simply because barbarians from the frozen edge of the world had ships and axes. Until one blood-red dawn, when impossible shield walls formed on African sand, and 2 centuries of certainty shattered with the sound of Viking boots hitting the beach. Viking warfare was born from necessity and perfected through generations of men who understood that survival itself demanded martial excellence. In the harsh lands of Scandinavia, every free man was a potential warrior, not as romantic ideal, but as practical reality. A farmer who couldn't fight was a dead farmer. A merchant who couldn't defend his ship was a poor merchant. This created a military culture fundamentally different from the professional armies of southern empires. Vikings didn't have standing forces or noble cavalry classes. They had communities where combat skill was as essential as knowing how to fish or navigate by stars. The shield wall embodied this philosophy perfectly. 3 rows of warriors, shields overlapping like scales on a serpent, each man responsible for protecting himself and his brothers. When properly formed, a shield wall became something greater than the sum of its parts. A mobile fortress of wood and iron that could absorb cavalry charges, withstand arrow volleys, and advance with inexorable momentum. The front rank held position while the second thrust spears through gaps, and the third prepared to step forward when men fell. It required discipline, coordination, and absolute trust. Break formation and you died. Hold together and you became nearly unstoppable against enemies who fought as individuals. Behind those shields stood men shaped by a warrior culture that weaponized psychological terror as effectively as physical violence. Berserkers, elite fighters who entered battle with seemingly suicidal fury, created chaos in enemy ranks, not just through skill, but through the horrifying spectacle of men who appeared to welcome death. When defenders faced warriors who screamed challenges, bit their shields, and charged into spear points with savage joy, traditional calculations about morale and self-preservation stopped making sense. Viking longships made all of this mobile in ways that redefined naval warfare. Shallow-drafted vessels that could beach on any coastline, navigate rivers deep into enemy territory, and outrun heavier warships combined speed, versatility, and range that no Mediterranean fleet could match. Crews that could navigate by sun and stars, read currents and weather patterns, and sustain voyages across open ocean possessed seamanship that turned the sea from barrier into highway. Their weapons reflected a tactical philosophy built on close-quarters devastation. Bearded axes designed to hook shields and pull down defenders, axes for fighting in confined spaces, swords weighted for chopping through bone and armor, every tool optimized for the brutal reality of shield wall combat, where survival depended on killing efficiently in arm's reach. By 859, this formidable military machine faced a strategic crisis. Northern Europe had been raided so thoroughly that defenses had hardened everywhere. Coastal monasteries built walls. Kingdoms organized rapid response forces. The element of surprise that made early Viking raids so profitable had eroded through repetition. Easy targets were gone. Wealthy ones were fortified. The saturated raiding grounds of Britain and Francia offered diminishing returns at increasing cost. Hastein and Bjorn Ironside saw the problem clearly and proposed a solution that seemed insane until you considered their capabilities. If familiar waters held no more opportunity, they would find unfamiliar ones. If northern coasts were defended, they would strike southern shores. If Christian Europe had learned to resist Vikings, they would teach the Islamic Mediterranean what northern fury meant. 62 longships, 3,000 warriors. A campaign into waters where no Viking fleet had operated, against enemies who had never faced shield walls, towards cities that had never needed to defend against amphibious Norse assault. The Vikings didn't fight like any army Muslim commanders had encountered. No cavalry charges, no siege patience, just interlocked shields, coordinated fury, and the terrifying discipline of men who treated death as an acceptable outcome if it came with glory. The plan wasn't reckless. It was audacious strategic thinking from warriors who understood their own capabilities and saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. The Straits of Gibraltar had guarded the Mediterranean's western entrance since before Rome fell. 9 miles of treacherous water where the Atlantic met the inland sea, where currents ran with brutal force and winds shifted without warning. It was a choke point that Muslim naval power had controlled for over a century, patrolled regularly by Cordoban warships that watched for Christian raiders or pirates foolish enough to test Islamic dominance. For any northern fleet attempting to enter the Mediterranean, the straits represented more than a geographical challenge. They were a gauntlet where the entire expedition could be detected, intercepted, and destroyed before reaching their hunting grounds. Hastein understood this. Rather than attempting a direct crossing that would announce their presence like a battle horn, the Viking fleet spent weeks raiding along the Iberian coast, testing Muslim responses, gathering intelligence, and capturing sailors who knew these waters intimately. Interrogated navigators revealed patrol schedules. Captured fishermen described current patterns and safe passages. Each raid gathered not just plunder, but knowledge, building a picture of how Cordoba's navy operated and where gaps existed in their coverage. The crossing itself required patience that contradicted Viking reputation for impulsive violence. Rather than attempting to move 62 longships through the straits as a single fleet, a spectacle impossible to miss, they dispersed into smaller groups. 5 ships here, 8 there. Each group waited for optimal conditions, choosing moonless nights and favorable winds. They slipped through the narrow passage over multiple nights, timing their movements to avoid patrol routes, using darkness and their shallow draft vessels to beach on remote shores when Muslim warships passed too close. By the time Cordoba's coastal watchers realized that a major Viking fleet had entered the Mediterranean, the longships were already dispersed, hunting. When Muslim patrol ships finally spotted them, dozens of dragon-prowed vessels sailing confidently through waters that belonged to Islam, the patrol commander sent urgent warnings back to port. But who would believe him? Northmen in the Mediterranean? It was like reporting dragons in the desert. By the time his message reached commanders who might take it seriously, the Vikings had vanished into the vastness of the inland sea. The Balearic Islands became their testing ground. Quick strikes against coastal settlements taught them how Muslim defenders responded to raids, how quickly reinforcements could arrive, what tactics Islamic forces employed. Each attack refined their understanding of this new theatre. They learned that Mediterranean cities relied heavily on naval warning systems that worked perfectly against known threats, but struggled to track fast-moving longships that could beach anywhere. They discovered that local garrisons expected pirates or rival Islamic forces, not organized Norse warbands. Moving south along the North African coast, Viking scouts evaluated potential targets with calculating eyes. Too large a city meant strong defenses and rapid reinforcement. Too small meant insufficient plunder to justify the risk. They needed a target wealthy enough to make the impossible journey worthwhile, defended well enough to prove Viking capabilities, but vulnerable enough to ensure victory. When they chose their objective and the fleet converged for the final approach, the sight must have seemed impossible to any witness. 62 longships appearing off the Moroccan coast, where no northern vessel had ever sailed. dragon heads carved into prows, catching the sun, striped sails marking them as foreigners who had crossed barriers that were supposed to be absolute. By the time alarm was raised, they were already beaching. By the time defenders understood the threat, Viking boots were already hitting sand. The impossible had become real, and the Mediterranean would never be the same. The garrison defending that stretch of North African coast was exactly what 2 centuries of Islamic military tradition produced: professional, experienced, and confident in their ability to handle any threat the Mediterranean might produce. These weren't untested recruits or ceremonial guards. They were veterans who had fought Berber cavalry raids, defended against rival Islamic dynasties competing for territory, and maintained security along a coastline that saw its share of piracy and banditry. Their commander had earned his position through competence demonstrated across 20 years of service. His men trained regularly, maintained their equipment meticulously, and knew their defensive protocols as thoroughly as they knew prayers. Everything about their preparation made perfect sense for the threats they faced. Cavalry tactics dominated their training because Berber raiders attacked on horseback. Siege defense received attention because rival emirs sometimes brought engines and patience. Rapid response drills prepared them for land-based incursions that required quick deployment to threatened positions. Their entire tactical education focused on enemies who fought according to military principles they understood. Forces that used cavalry for mobility, respected the logic of fortified positions, and could be predicted based on established patterns of Islamic and Berber warfare. When intelligence reports began filtering in about strange ships spotted along the coast, the garrison leadership evaluated them through this framework of experience. The descriptions were vague, sometimes contradictory. Some witnesses claimed unusual vessel designs, others mentioned foreign-looking crews. But strange ships appeared regularly in Mediterranean waters, smugglers using unconventional craft to avoid patrols, merchants from distant ports with unfamiliar construction, pirates testing coastal defenses before deciding whether to risk an attack. The garrison commander assessed the reports with professional judgment honed by years of separating genuine threats from false alarms. Probably smugglers avoiding trade inspections. Maybe pirates probing for vulnerable targets. Definitely not a coordinated military threat requiring full mobilization. Even if the rumors about Northmen had substance, and that seemed unlikely given the geographical impossibility, Vikings were raiders who struck monasteries and fled. They weren't organized forces capable of projecting military power thousands of miles from home into hostile waters. Standard protocols seemed appropriate: increase coastal patrols modestly, alert watchtowers to maintain extra vigilance, position a reserve force ready to respond if pirates actually attempted something. These were reasonable, measured responses that balanced security with the reality that most threats never materialized and full mobilization was expensive, disruptive, and created panic over shadows. The fatal flaw wasn't incompetence or laziness. It was preparing for enemies you understood rather than enemies you'd never faced. The garrison commander had fought Berber cavalry, so he positioned troops to counter mounted attacks. He'd defended against siege engines, so he reinforced gates and walls against battering rams. He'd trained for every threat the Mediterranean could produce, according to his tactical education and decades of experience. But his entire framework had one blind spot he didn't know existed. What do you do when an enemy you were trained to dismiss as impossible forms professional battle lines on your beach? When warriors without cavalry create formations that cavalry can't break. When raiders you expected to flee instead advance with the disciplined coordination of elite infantry. By the time the garrison commander stood on his walls staring at shield walls gleaming in the morning sun, at dragon-prowed longships scarred across sand that had never known northern keels, at 3,000 warriors arranged with the calm precision of men who had done this before, by the time he understood that every assumption underlying his defensive preparations was catastrophically wrong, it was already too late. The Vikings were already forming ranks, dawn was already breaking, and 2 centuries of tactical doctrine was about to prove worthless against an enemy who fought by rules no Muslim commander had ever needed to learn. The watchtower guard who spotted them first thought exhaustion was playing tricks with his eyes. Dawn was breaking over the Mediterranean, painting the water in shades of copper and gold, when dark shapes began materializing against the lightening sky. Ships, no, longships. The distinctive silhouettes were unmistakable even at distance, dragon-headed prows cutting toward shore with purposeful speed. One ship he might have dismissed. 5 could be traders. But as light spread across the water, he started counting with mounting horror. 30 ships, 40, 60. More still appearing from the pre-dawn darkness, moving in coordinated waves toward the beach. That can't be what I'm seeing, his mind insisted, even as his hands reached for the alarm bell. Northmen don't sail in these waters. Vikings don't operate this far south. This is impossible. But the bell was already ringing, its urgent clamour shattering the morning quiet. Because impossible or not, those were longships beaching on sand that had never known northern keels. What happened next transformed shock into something approaching panic. The ships didn't beach chaotically like pirates seeking quick plunder. They landed in organized sequences, warriors poring over gunwales with disciplined efficiency. No raider confusion, no individual looters scattering across sand. Instead, shield walls began forming, 3 rows deep, perfectly coordinated, interlocking like the scales of some monstrous serpent. The sight was so alien to Mediterranean warfare that watchers struggled to process what tactical doctrine this represented. Messengers raced toward Garrison headquarters on horses driven to lather. Alarm bells echoed from tower to tower along the coast, each one adding to a chorus of warning that said something unprecedented was happening. The garrison commander was already running toward the coastal vantage point when the first reports reached him, his mind racing through possibilities, discarding each one as insufficient to explain what his scouts were describing. Then he saw them himself. Shield walls, actual professional shield walls, advancing up the beach with the terrible patience of men who had done this before. Behind them, more longships were beaching, more warriors deploying, the entire operation proceeding with military precision that made mockery of the word raid. This wasn't pirates testing defenses, this was an army establishing a beachhead. Quick decisions came from training, even as his mind reeled. Deploy available cavalry to the coastal approach. Send fast riders for reinforcements from inland garrisons, knowing they wouldn't arrive for hours at minimum. Form defensive positions using standard protocols for repelling amphibious assault. The orders were correct according to every manual he'd studied, every battle he'd fought, every tactical principle he'd learned across 20 years of professional warfare, except nothing in his experience prepared him for what he was actually facing. Muslim cavalry formed up, ready to execute charges that had broken Berber raiders and scattered pirate bands for decades. But the enemy advancing toward them had no horses to counter, no mobile formations to disrupt, no individual warriors to target, just that inexorable wall of shields and iron moving inland with the inevitability of rising tide. The garrison commander stared at the shield walls and felt something he'd never experienced in 2 decades of warfare: complete tactical confusion. Everything he knew about combat involved cavalry mobility, flanking maneuvers, exploiting gaps in enemy formations. The enemy in front of him had no horses, refused to break formation, and advanced like an iron wall with legs. How do you flank what pivots as a single unit? How do you exploit gaps in something that has no gaps? How do you defeat 3,000 warriors who fight as one organism rather than 3,000 individuals? Within an hour of dawn, both sides understood what this would be. Not a raid that could be bought off with tribute or scattered with a cavalry charge. A real battle. Professional warriors testing professional defenders. Viking discipline against Islamic military tradition. And somewhere in the commander's gut, beneath the determination to defend his city and the courage born from decades of service, a cold certainty was forming. He had trained his entire life to fight enemies he understood. The men forming ranks on his beach fought by rules he'd never learned. The first cavalry charge was textbook perfect. Muslim riders formed up in disciplined ranks, lances levelled, executing manoeuvres that had broken enemy formations from Andalusia to Damascus. They accelerated across the sand with the coordinated thunder that had shattered Berber warbands and sent pirates fleeing into the sea. Every element was exactly as doctrine prescribed. Timing, spacing, the angled approach designed to maximize impact. It should have worked. It had always worked. The horses balked first, Animals that had charged into spear walls and weathered arrow storms suddenly refused to slam into that interlocked barrier of wood and iron. They veered, stumbled, broke stride at the last moment, as instinct overrode training. Riders who maintained momentum found their lances striking shields that didn't shatter, but absorbed impact like waves against stone. Then the axes came, bearded blades hooking over shield rims, pulling riders from saddles, killing with brutal efficiency in the chaos of failing charges. Muslim commanders regrouped and tried again, adjusting approach angles, attempting to find weak points in the formation. Arrow volleys rained down on Viking positions, finding targets, drawing blood, forcing casualties. But the shield walls held. Warriors in the front rank fell and were immediately replaced by men from the second row, the formation closing gaps like living tissue healing wounds. The discipline was inhuman, terrifying in its perfection. Muslim infantry moved forward, attempting what cavalry could not, sustained pressure to crack those shields through sheer determined combat. Spearmen thrust at gaps, swordsmen tested the flanks, but every attempt met the same result. The shields held, the formation pivoted to meet threats, and when Muslim soldiers pushed close enough for hand-to-hand combat, they discovered Viking weapons were designed precisely for this range. Short, brutal, devastating in the crush of bodies, where longer cavalry lances became liabilities. Flanking maneuvers met adaptive responses. The shield walls didn't fight like static fortifications waiting to be outmaneuvered. They moved, rotated, reformed to address threats from multiple directions while maintaining their integrity. It was like fighting water. Strike one point and the formation simply flowed around the attack, then closed again with undiminished strength. Then the Berserkers came, elite warriors who attacked with fury that seemed to transcend human limitation, screaming challenges, striking with axes that blurred in the sunlight. Muslim soldiers who had faced enemies driven by religious conviction or territorial ambition now confronted men whose relationship to death appeared fundamentally alien. These weren't warriors fighting to survive. They were warriors who seemed to welcome mortality if it came with glory, and that psychological dimension created terror beyond physical threat. The cavalry charge should have worked. It had worked against every enemy Muslim forces had encountered. But when lances struck Viking shields, the wall didn't break. It absorbed, countered, and killed. Muslim riders learned too late that tactics perfected against other armies meant nothing against an enemy who fought by entirely different rules. By mid-morning, the Vikings had pushed close enough to assault the gates. Axes that could split ship hulls began working on wood and iron with methodical efficiency. Teams rotated, fresh warriors replacing exhausted ones without pause, while defenders above poured arrows, stones, heated oil. Viking casualties mounted, but the assault never wavered, never broke rhythm. They didn't fight to win territory. They fought to create terror, to demonstrate that nothing could stop them, that gates which had stood for centuries were merely temporary obstacles. When the outer gate finally splintered, combat compressed into the narrow passage where every tactical advantage Muslim defenders possessed evaporated. No room for cavalry. Archer angles became impossible. The confined space where defenders should have held became a killing ground where Viking weapons, designed for shipboard fighting and tight quarters, proved devastatingly superior. Muslim warriors fought with desperate courage, buying time for civilians to flee deeper into the city, holding positions until they fell. Their bravery was never in question, but courage without applicable tactics is just heroic dying. The Vikings advanced through shattered gates with the same terrible discipline they'd shown on the beach, and both sides knew the outcome was no longer in doubt. Only the scale of defeat remained uncertain. The gates held longer than Viking commanders probably expected. For hours, Muslim defenders fought with the desperation of men protecting not just a city, but the promise of security those walls represented. They poured everything they had through murder holes and from battlements, arrows, stones, boiling oil, the accumulated defensive wisdom of 2 centuries. Vikings fell, were dragged back by their brothers, replaced by fresh warriors who took up axes without hesitation. The assault rotated in organized shifts, ensuring maximum pressure without exhaustion, demonstrating a level of tactical sophistication that made mockery of any assumption about barbarian raiders. Then came the sound that would echo in survivors' nightmares for decades. First a crack, wood splitting under relentless punishment, then splintering as iron bands tore free from timber that had stood since grandfathers were children. Finally, catastrophic failure, the gates collapsing inward with a thunder that seemed to shake the foundations of certainty itself. For 200 years those gates had symbolized security, had marked the boundary between civilization and chaos. In one morning, they became kindling. Vikings poured through the breach in organized waves, not as a mob but as coordinated units that had drilled for urban combat. Muslim defenders attempted to hold the streets, using their knowledge of every alley and courtyard to mount ambushes and defensive stands. But Viking small unit tactics, perfected through generations of raiding fortified monasteries and European towns, proved devastatingly effective in confined urban terrain. They moved in groups of 10 to 15 warriors, shields creating mobile walls that turned narrow lanes into kill zones. Key positions fell in sequence with the inevitability of dominoes. The market where merchants had traded that morning became a Viking strongpoint by noon. The mosque where faithful had prayed at dawn was secured before midday prayers. The administrative centre, where the city's records and minor treasury were kept, fell to warriors who seemed to know exactly what they were searching for, suggesting intelligence gathered during their Mediterranean raids. The garrison commander made his final stand at the palace approaches with what remained of his professional soldiers. These weren't conscripts or city militia. They were veterans who understood they were buying time for civilians to flee, for women and children to hide, for the city's most valuable members to seek sanctuary. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal, personal. Muslim warriors sold their lives as expensively as courage could manage, and Vikings paid that price without hesitation because they understood professional soldiers when they faced them. When the moment of surrender came, it wasn't cowardice that prompted it, but mathematics. The garrison commander, wounded and surrounded, recognized that continued resistance meant only additional deaths without changing outcomes. His remaining men were outnumbered, exhausted, fighting an enemy whose discipline never wavered, despite their own casualties. Surrender was tactical assessment, not failure of nerve. Vikings took captives with the same calculated efficiency they'd shown throughout the assault. High-value prisoners, the commander, wealthy merchants, anyone worth ransom, were separated and secured. Strategic locations were garrisoned. Then the looting began, but not as chaotic pillaging. This was systematic extraction of wealth, organized searches of treasuries and wealthy homes, selection of portable valuables that justified the impossible journey they'd undertaken. When the gates finally shattered, the sound echoed across the city like the breaking of a promise. And every Muslim warrior who heard it understood a truth more devastating than physical defeat. We weren't defeated because we were cowards. We were defeated because our enemy was something we had no framework to fight. They brought war we'd never trained for, tactics we'd never encountered, and a discipline that transformed northern barbarians into the most terrifying force the Mediterranean had seen in generations. The city had fallen. But something larger had shattered. The assumption that Islamic military supremacy was unassailable, that distance meant protection, that the Mediterranean belonged to anyone absolutely. The plundering was as organized as the battle had been. Viking warriors moved through the city with systematic efficiency that spoke to experience gained across decades of raids. The treasury was emptied first, gold, silver, coins that represented the city's accumulated wealth. Then markets where merchants kept reserves, mosques where religious endowments had been stored. Wealthy homes identified through intelligence or local informants who chose cooperation over resistance. Every movement was calculated, every choice strategic. Heavy furniture was left behind, portable wealth was prioritized, time was treated as a tactical resource as valuable as gold, captive selection followed equally cold mathematics. The garrison commander and surviving officers were worth significant ransoms, warriors respected warriors even across cultural divides, wealthy merchants whose families could pay, craftsmen whose skills might prove useful in northern lands, young people who could be sold in slave markets. Each captive represented a calculation balancing ransom value against the food and space they'd consume on the voyage home. Only those who added strategic or material worth made it to the ships. Throughout the extraction, Viking discipline never wavered. Defensive formations were maintained. Sentries watched approaches even as their brothers loaded plunder. Small units patrolled key positions, ensuring no organized counterattack could threaten the withdrawal. The same tactical sophistication that won the battle now protected their retreat, demonstrating this wasn't desperate raiders fleeing with stolen goods, but a military operation executing its final phase. By afternoon, the longships were loaded and ready. There would be no pursuit. Muslim forces were shattered, scattered, demoralized. Reinforcements from inland garrisons were still hours away, too distant to prevent what had already succeeded. The Vikings pushed their ships back into the Mediterranean with the same coordinated effort they'd shown landing, oars finding rhythm, sails rising to catch favorable winds. As the dragon-prowed vessels disappeared beyond the horizon, survivors emerged from hiding to survey what remained. The walls still stood, most buildings were intact, the physical city had survived. But something else had been destroyed that could never be rebuilt, the certainty that geography meant safety, that Mediterranean waters protected them, that northern barbarians belonged to someone else's nightmares. Survivor accounts began spreading even before the last Viking sail vanished. Traumatized witnesses described warriors who fought like demons, like nothing human, men who seemed to welcome death if it came with glory. The stories grew in the telling, as traumatic memories always do. 3,000 warriors became tens of thousands by the time reports reached distant cities. Hours of fighting stretched into days of siege. Each retelling amplified the terror because the psychological need to explain defeat demanded enemies larger than life, more numerous than reality, more terrifying than mere humans. The message spread faster than facts, carried by merchants fleeing to safer ports, by garrison survivors seeking new posts, by refugees whose presence alone testified to catastrophe. Vikings can strike anywhere. Distance is meaningless. The Mediterranean is no longer safe. Each coastal city that heard the news felt a chill of recognition. If it happened there, it could happen here. Within days, ransoms were being negotiated through intermediaries. Within weeks, coastal garrisons across North Africa were being reinforced. Within months, Muslim naval commanders were receiving emergency funding to expand patrols, but no amount of preparation could undo the fundamental revelation. A city had been sacked in one morning by an enemy who shouldn't have existed in these waters. The impossible had walked off longships, formed battle lines on African sand, defeated professional defenders using tactics no one had trained to counter, then vanished as impossibly as they'd arrived. The Vikings had left, but terror remained, spreading like plague from survivor to listener, from witness to commander, from one frightened coastal city to the next. The demons had departed. The nightmares were just beginning. The ransom demands arrived within weeks, delivered through intermediaries operating along the Iberian coast. They were calculated with professional precision, high enough to extract maximum wealth, low enough that payment remained possible. The amounts themselves were humiliating, forcing cities to acknowledge they were negotiating with barbarians who had defeated them, paying tribute to raiders who had sailed impossible distances to prove Islamic forces were vulnerable. The gold was gathered, the captives were returned, and each transaction reinforced the central lesson. Vikings could reach any coast, defeat any garrison, and extract payment from the Mediterranean's supposed masters. Coastal cities across North Africa entered crisis mode. Emergency councils convened. Garrison commanders who had dismissed Viking threats weeks earlier now demanded reinforcements. Cordoba's response was immediate and massive. Emergency funding for naval expansion, orders to triple patrol frequencies, a comprehensive coastal fortification program that redirected resources from other military priorities. Ships were commissioned, crews were trained, watchtowers were built at closer intervals along every vulnerable stretch of shore. Most significantly, military doctrine itself underwent revision. For the first time, Islamic commanders began training troops specifically to counter shield wall tactics. Officers studied reports from survivors, attempting to reconstruct Viking formations and develop responses. How do you flank an enemy that pivots as one organism? How do you defeat infantry that holds formation under cavalry charges? The questions that had seemed theoretical before 859 became urgent practical concerns. Intelligence networks were established to track Viking movements, coordinate warnings between coastal cities, and provide early alert when northern ships entered Mediterranean waters. But tracking 62 mobile longships across a sea the size of the Mediterranean proved nearly impossible. The Vikings continued their campaign, striking targets in Italy, raiding the southern coast of France, demonstrating this wasn't a singular audacious adventure, but a fundamental shift in their operational range. Muslim poets began writing verses about the pale warriors from the frozen north, transforming historical trauma into cultural memory. Scholars debated theological implications. Was this divine punishment for moral failings? A test of faith? Strategic failure that demanded military reform? The discussions revealed how deeply the raid had shaken assumptions about Islamic supremacy and divine favor. Christian observers across Europe drew their own conclusions. If Vikings could terrify Muslim forces, if Islamic military might could be humbled by northern raiders, then perhaps the narrative of inevitable Muslim dominance was myth rather than destiny. The psychological impact rippled beyond military circles into religious and political calculations across the Mediterranean world. The transformation was most visible in garrison life. Every strange sail on the horizon brought heightened alert. Commanders drilled troops on tactics that hadn't existed in their doctrine before 859. How to fight shield walls, how to counter amphibious assaults, how to respond when enemies don't follow rules you've trained against. Young warriors grew up learning about Viking tactics as part of standard military education, preparing for threats their fathers had dismissed as impossible. The Mediterranean would never again be exclusively Islamic waters. Viking raids became a regular feature of the strategic landscape, continuing intermittently until the 11th century. Some were repulsed by better prepared defenders. Others succeeded despite improved defences. But every appearance of northern longships reinforced the lesson that distance was illusion and reputation meant nothing against enemies who refused to accept assumed limitations. The battle lasted 1 day. The terror lasted 3 generations. Muslim warriors who had conquered from Spain to Damascus learned that past victories guarantee nothing against enemies who rewrite warfare's rules. Children grew up hearing tales of pale warriors who appeared without warning, fought without fear, and vanished like nightmares that leave scars. The Vikings had accomplished something more devastating than conquest. They had shattered the psychological certainty that made Islamic Mediterranean dominance seem eternal. In the decades after 859, every Muslim commander from Morocco to Syria understood 3 truths their predecessors never needed to contemplate. Distance is an illusion, safety is temporary, and the horizon always holds possibilities, both terrible and transformative, that no amount of past glory can defend against. The Vikings had terrified an empire not by destroying it, but by proving it could be terrified, and in that revelation they changed the Mediterranean world forever.